Hello, and welcome to What's New in Historical Fiction. My name is Colin Mustful. I am the founder and editor of History Through Fiction, and I will be the moderator of this panel. All of our panelists are here. They're waiting in the wing right now. I'll just give a brief introduction of Crowdcast. I do want to let you know that this is actually a new version of Crowdcast, and there might be a few bugs, a few technical difficulties. We've been working through those already, but hopefully everything works well. If you don't hear something or the visual is not working, you might just have to leave and come back in. But hopefully everything goes smoothly. We might have a few technical difficulties, but we'll work through that. In any case, thank you so much for being here for What's New in Historical Fiction. We have a really great panel for you. It's just some great authors with amazing novels, and I'm really excited to talk to them. You'll see on the right side of your screen, you have a Q&A feature. There's a little box with a question mark in it. If you have any questions for the panelists, go ahead and put your questions there. There's also a chat, and that's on top of all those little icons, two little boxes, and then you can say hello, let us know where you're joining from, maybe what you're reading. If you've read any one of these books, let us know how much you loved it. I don't have any polls. You can see there's a little bar graph. There's no polls. And then people, there's like three little people, and that just shows you who else is here today. Finally, there is a Get Your Book green button on the bottom. That'll take you to a landing page with all of these authors' books, and all of their books are available through bookshop.org. And the reason we link to Bookshop instead of Amazon is because they give a percentage of their revenue back to local booksellers. And so we want to support local booksellers that way. All right, without further ado, I'm going to bring our panelists on the stage. And I'm going to move myself to the left of the stage. Okay, well, let's start out with Jennifer Chiaverini. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your book?
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this wonderful History Through Fiction broadcast. My name is Jennifer Chiaverini, and I am the author of 40 books, and Switchboard Soldiers is my 32nd novel. I've also done some nonfiction. And this story, like so many of my books, features some truly inspirational and amazing women that I discovered in the course of writing earlier books. One of the things I love best about historical fiction is bringing to life, or bringing into the light, women who made very important contributions to history, but maybe they just ended up in the footnotes of somebody else's story, if they ended up in the book at all. Or, they made contributions that were unheralded, or someone else claimed credit for them. So I like to draw these women out from the past and help make their stories better known, so that they can get all the credit they deserve for the contributions they made. And Switchboard Soldiers is about the very brave American women who served in the U.S. Army Signal Corps as telephone operators during World War I.
Thank you, Jennifer. And yeah, we're going to get more into the history. Each one of these authors has some really fascinating history in their books, and so we're going to get to some of that. Shaunna, if you could introduce yourself and tell us about your book.
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. I'm Shaunna Edwards. Hard going after Jennifer because I am a debut novelist. I co-wrote The Thread Collectors with one of my very great friends, the author Alyson Richman. The Thread Collectors is an interesting story. We take two marginalized communities, the Black community and the Jewish community during the Civil War, and we tell their stories through two couples. We have two men. They are both brilliant musicians. There's William, he's an escaped enslaved person, and Jacob, who is a Jewish immigrant, and they meet on the battlefields in Louisiana. And through them and through the stories of the women that they've left behind, we really hope to illuminate how everyday people got through one of the darkest times in our history, and more importantly, how friends found shared purpose and ultimately overcame tragedy. And I will say that for both Alyson and I, it was really important that we stay rooted in the history, but also bring our own family history to the book. So that's why it's been very much a labor of love. Oh, and if you want to know a little bit more about me, I guess not just the book, I am what some would call a reformed lawyer. I used to practice for about 14 years, but now I work in talent management and diversity, equity, and inclusion at an international law firm. So I have a day job, Alyson calls it, so a lot of our time is spent writing late in the night and early in the mornings.
Thank you, Shaunna, and I love your background. I don't know how much time you put together, did putting that together, but it looks amazing.
Thank you.
Well, let's go to Alyson, the co-author of The Thread Collectors. Alyson, if you could introduce yourself and whatever you might be able to add to what Shaunna said there. Alyson, you're muted, so hit that microphone to unmute.
Okay. Hi, Colin, and hello to all of you wonderful readers who've joined us this evening on the History Through Fiction panel. Shaunna did such a wonderful job describing the background of our collaborative novel, The Thread Collectors. It comes out August 30th, so this is actually our first live event, a virtual live event talking about the book, because it doesn't actually officially come to bookstores for another, I think 12 days. But we're so excited to talk to you about the novel. Just to sort of add on to what Shaunna already said, my writing is my day job. This is my 8th historical novel. I've been writing, straight out of the gate after graduating from college. I was an art history major, a failed painter myself. I always wanted to be a painter like my mother, but I discovered that I could paint using words and also fall into different time periods and cultures and explore that and sort of put my, fingerprint on trying to create novels that explore the creative experience against the backdrop of war. So as Shaunna illuminated, we do have 2 musicians, one Black, one Jewish in this novel. I guess we'll talk more deeply about it later, but I do have a great uncle who was a musician in the Union Army, and I wanted to pull from that family tree to sort of create our character of Jacob. And for me personally, it's just really important and sort of in a way spiritual to create characters which pull from different artistic backgrounds to sort of figure out a way to make sense against the backdrop of war and to find oftentimes a form of resistance in their creative pursuits in a time of war. And that's something that you see in almost all of my novels.
Thank you, Alyson. I think that's really wonderful. I love what you said about painting with words. That's beautiful. Addison, if you could introduce yourself and tell us about your book.
All right. Hello, I'm Addison. So we have an Alyson and an Addison. I am in New York. I'm an ESL teacher, elementary school, and then I'm also the author of 2 historical fiction novels. So The Light of Luna Park came out last year, and The War Librarian came out last week. So it's brand new. And this book is it's a dual timeline novel. So it takes place in 1918 and 1976. And in 1918, Emmeline Balakin is a war librarian. She works in France during World War I, like Jennifer's Switchboard soldiers. And she is a librarian at a base hospital, and her job is to prescribe books for the soldiers. So the soldiers who are wounded, the soldiers who are psychologically scarred, her job is to keep them entertained, help them get educated, help take their mind off where they are and what's going on. And then she's also dealing, and we'll get more into this when we talk about the history, but she's also dealing with issues of censorship, even amongst all these obvious concrete horrors of war. And then there's 1976, Kathleen Carr, whose first co-ed class at the Naval Academy. And you can imagine all the horrors and abuses she faced there. So she's dealing with all of that, with a personal tragedy, and then also with some secrets from the past that are threatening her position today.
Thank you, Addison. And I've actually talked to Addison about her book already. She's on our podcast, and that'll be coming out shortly. And I'm actually going to send out information about that next Monday. But I'm excited to talk more to you about this great novel.
Yes,
It looks like
it was
Jennifer
so fun
said
the first time.
Jennifer said she's read it and she enjoyed it. Well, finally, let's go to Madeline. If you could introduce yourself and tell us about your book.
Hey everyone, Madeline Martin here, and I have written the Librarian Spy, which came out a couple weeks ago. And this is my second historical fiction, but I have published about like 36 books at this point. My previous ones have been historical romance, and my previous historical fiction was The Last Bookshop in London. So in The Librarian Spy, it's basically about the American librarians that were sent from libraries in America to neutral countries to gather intel. I am a huge history nerd and research fiend. I think we probably all are in this group. And I'm sure you guys probably all are as well, everyone who's joined us tonight. And I really, had a lot cut out with this book because it takes place in America, in Portugal, and also in France. Because half the book is with my American librarian in Portugal, really gathering a lot of publications like underground newspapers, manuals, pamphlets, whatever she can get her hands on to send back to America. And my other heroine works with the French Resistance. She actually is modeled after a woman who actually existed with the French Resistance, working with the printing presses to create these clandestine newspapers. So really I had 3 different countries to research with writing this book. And I was also incredibly fortunate to get to travel to all 3 of these countries to do my research as well. It really just highlights like what was all kind of said about the women who, really haven't had an opportunity to have their stories told. It's interesting doing a lot of my French resistance research and reading through a lot of these firsthand accounts. And a lot of these women are just saying like, I just did what I had to do. They don't really see what they did as this huge, like, glorified thing. It's really just like there was something to be done and I did it. And so I love that we're all really giving these women a chance to have their place in history and really be recognized for all the amazing things that they've done.
Very well said, Madeline. If there was an in-person audience, everyone would be clapping. Just think about. Well, let's go back to Jennifer. I'd like to know, the title of your book is Switchboard Soldier. So what is a switchboard soldier? And also, I'd like to know, what did these women risk by joining the U.S. Army Signal Corps? Oh, you're muted there, Jennifer. Okay.
Here we go. Much better. In 1917, when the United States entered the Great War, General Pershing, the commander of the American troops, went over to France while soldiers were being recruited and trained back in the States. He went over there to start establishing the infrastructure and everything he would need in order to carry out the business of war, the ugly, horrible business of war. And when he arrived, he very soon learned that communications were going to be a problem. At this point, radios had been invented, but the golden age of radio didn't take place until the 20s. So most commands, not all, but most commands that went from the military headquarters to other bases, to the American officers' counterparts in the French and British armies, all the way up to orders sent directly to the front, requests for backup, requests for supplies. Almost all of those were conducted by telephone. And these were, you probably have seen them in the old movies or old TV shows. You had the big switchboard and you have women, because it was almost always women, seated on these tall stools with their headphones and their mouthpieces. And then when a call came in, a light would go off on the board and they had cables and they'd have to plug one end of the jack in and ask for the number. And then when they got the number, they had to make the connection to the caller. If they were lucky, it was right in front of them. Sometimes they'd have to stretch over in front of their friend or their coworker. If it was a long distance call, they'd have to build a relay that would go from their exchange to another exchange and on and on and on. And that could take hours. So it was a high pace, high stress, very demanding job. And if you were a well-trained, experienced operator in the US, it was quite an exciting opportunity for a woman to be able to, there were a lot of jobs that they were excluded from. So we had a really great service here in the US. We had the best technology in the world. And when Pershing got to France, he was expecting the same level of service, but he quickly found out that that was not the case. France had been experiencing several years of war, so a lot of their infrastructure was destroyed, and their equipment, a lot of it was pretty antique by American standards. And the service wasn't quite what the style that they were expecting. So the first thing Pershing did was he asked for all of the equipment to be sent over. And so a lot of men came over to build those switchboard exchanges and run the lines, because this, no wireless yet. You had to have an actual physical wire carrying that message. And they tried to train the men, male soldiers, and that's redundant because at this point, all soldiers in the army were male. They tried to train the men to run these switchboards. They started with training telegraph operators because a lot of the skills seemed kind of similar. So when they were trained, the men could connect a call in about a minute on average. That might sound pretty good until you think about how back in the States, a trained, skilled telephone operator could make a call in 10 seconds. And if you think about all of the important information that they were all the messages that were being carried out, seconds could mean the difference between a battle won, a battle lost, a victory or utter defeat, lives saved, soldiers preserved. So you can understand why Pershing said, that 50 seconds was not something he was going to squander. So he asked the US Army, or he told the US Army, that they needed to get him the best telephone operators they could recruit and get them over to France as soon as possible. This put the Army in a bit of an awkward position because at this point, the Army was not permitting women to enlist. The Navy was ahead of them. They had already started recruiting women and letting them join up. Not so the Army. But when General Pershing says he wants the best telephone operators, well, you have to get rid of custom and you have to set aside some of your prejudices and you have to start recruiting women. So they sent out a call with advertisements and notices put on posters in the break rooms of all of these different telephone companies. And they said that they wanted women to apply. They did not try to disguise at all that this was going to be very difficult, very dangerous work. But there were 3 criteria the women had to meet. First, of course, they had to be fantastic telephone operators. The second criterion was one that weeded out a lot of people who otherwise probably would have applied. They also had to be fluent in French. Not just they got an A in their French class in high school. They had to be absolutely fluent because sometimes they would be connecting calls between an American officer and his counterpart in the French army. And more often than not, the 2 men could not speak to each other. So in addition to connecting the calls, the operator had to translate the call in real time. And every word had to be absolutely perfect. And the third criterion was that the applicants had to be absolutely trustworthy because they were going to be dealing with a lot of important military intelligence. They had to be the sort of loyal citizens, the loyal people who would not only not intentionally divulge any information, but they were also clever enough that they wouldn't be tricked into giving anything away either. So 7,600 women applied for these jobs, and then it was narrowed down to a few hundred. And then in March of 1918, the first 33 switchboard soldiers sailed for France. And you ask what they risked. Well, they weren't in the trenches with the soldiers. But other than that, they risked everything the men did, everything the male soldiers did, whether they were posted to the rear at a services of supply base, or whether they were posted at a large exchange in Paris, which was undergoing bombardment, very, very devastating bombardment, or if they were closer to the front with General Pershing's headquarters, or moving to a more ramshackle exchange as the army, as the front moved eastward, and they were transported there to a very, haphazardly put together exchange. They risked bombardment, they risked death, they risked disease, because near the end of the war, in the spring of 1918 and in the fall of 1918, the Spanish flu, as it was called then, was sweeping through military bases and the troop ships carrying them across the ocean. On the ocean crossing, just like the soldiers, they risked being sunk by U-boats. So there was, and they also dealt with the regular hardships of serving in the military, poor rations, uncomfortable quarters, homesickness, profound homesickness. But what amazed me so much and impressed me so profoundly about these women was that they relished the challenge. Most of them weren't even able to vote at this point. It depended upon what state they lived in, but they weren't even able to fully participate in their own democracy, and yet they were willing to risk their own lives and undergo a lot of hardship over there in order to preserve democracy, in order to help out our allies, France and Belgium. And the more I read about them, the more I learned about them, the more humbled I was and impressed I was by their courage. And one of the things I really hope readers will take away from this book is that, they face the challenge of their day, and in a world that was in some ways very different from ours, but there are also a lot of consistencies when you think about women's rights and, shattering glass ceilings in the workplace. And I hope that readers, men and women alike, will take inspiration from that and think about those were the challenges that they faced in their day, and they were enormous. We face different challenges now. Some of them are similar, but if they faced their challenges and got through them, then we can take heart and know that we can do the same. And we can find our own courage as they did in facing the challenges that we confront in our own world.
Thank you, Jennifer. That's amazing. It just sounds like an amazing story, and I love how you were able to bring that all back around to today. And you gave us a lot of jumping off points there. I know I've already talked to Addison, and you talked about prejudice that had to be overcome, and it's incredible that despite what they accomplished, that prejudice persisted for so long in the military, and of course even to today. So I'm sure we'll talk more about that. I want to go next to Shaunna. If you could tell us a little bit more about the history of the thread collectors. I understand there's some family history there, and how much of this novel is factual and how much is fictionalized.
Absolutely. And there's so many things that Jennifer said that resonated. So we were very, very committed to making sure that the backdrop of the Civil War was accurately reflected while using fictionalized characters, but drawing from our family history. So I'll give you a few examples. We talk about prejudice in the armed forces, certainly during the Civil War, that was faced. Our two male characters, one's Black, one's Jewish. At the beginning of the Civil War, the Union Army, in spite of the fact that they were purportedly fighting for the rights of African Americans, although I happen to believe it was much more about economics as opposed to morality in the beginning, they wanted nothing to do with Black soldiers, some of whom were freedmen who risked their safety, risked their lives to join up. They allowed them to hang around on the edge of camp, but ultimately when the Union Army did take them in, they were relegated to doing things like digging ditches, burying the dead, really being servants in the Union Army. To the extent they were paid, when they started to be paid, they were paid far less rather than white soldiers and treated like second-class citizens. Unfortunately, Jewish soldiers were treated very similarly. And at one point in time, there was an executive order where Jewish soldiers were actually expelled from the Union Army because it was thought that there were Jewish merchants who were basically cheating the Union Army. So you think about this great, army that we think of as being on the side of right, but even within that army, there were so many things that were happening that today would be for us just shocking. So we wanted to illuminate that. And we chose just different periods of time to bring that home. There is a battle that's really important that happens in Louisiana. I actually was privileged enough to go to the battlefield and stand with the park ranger It was one of the first times, way before the battle depicted in Glory. When I say way before, I really mean a couple of months. But in Civil War time, way before, because there was like a battle almost every other day, Black soldiers were sent in to fight. They were given muskets. They were really proud of this opportunity, but they were sent in to fight on a landscape which their commanding officers had not bothered to even survey. They were sent in to a place where Confederate soldiers already had control of the high ground, and they were sent into a shooting gallery. And hundreds of them died, and their bodies laid there for weeks, rotting. And then when finally the Union captured that land and took control of it, the Black soldiers had to bury their compatriots, the people that were essentially sacrificed. And it's these moments that we really wanted to uncover. It's not all tragedy, it's not all dark, but I think it's important, particularly now when we're living in a really divisive time, that we don't look back and think that everything is so simple, right? There's another scene that we illuminate, and it takes place in New York because Jacob's wife, Lily, she is an abolitionist. She is living in New York, and we think maybe in the North, everyone felt like, yes, let's give rights to Black people. Let's, assimilate immigrants like Jewish people. That was far from the case. On the corner of 43rd Street and 5th Avenue, and Addison is now a New Yorker, so she can walk by, there was a colored children's asylum. And during the draft riots, which you may have seen in that Leonardo DiCaprio movie, Gangs of New York, they burned the colored children's asylum. And there were hundreds of children, all Black children at the time. Many of their parents had lost their lives already in the Civil War. And for the Northerners, once again, thinking of them as like on the side of right, it was an outlash. And it was, it was them saying, we don't feel like we as white people should give up our lives for people that we inherently think are second-class citizens to enjoy the same economic freedoms we do and the same physical freedoms. So we definitely wanted to ensure that we told a complicated and multi-layered story because it is complicated, it is multi-layered. This was a war fought in your backyard. It was impossible to stay neutral. But there's also a love story, and there is friendship, and there's family drama, all of these things that take place whether you're living in a time of peace or a time of war. So we brought in our family histories as well. I won't take Alyson's family story, I'll leave it to her, but from my perspective, a lot of the Black characters you will meet, they are modeled after ancestors, whether it be by name. The Black heroine's name is Stella. That is my mother's name, and she was named after a great aunt. She has a sister named Amine, and that is a family name. And she has a mother named Janie, and Janie is modeled after one of my female ancestors that managed to gain economic freedom. And there are aspects of the story, particularly when it comes to textile and embroidery and resourcefulness, that are very much part of how I grew up. I grew up with my grandmother quilting, my great-grandmother quilting. I still own those quilts today. And so when there are moments in time when Stella is actually creating maps to help enslaved men flee and go join the Union Army, and she's using all of these threads, that's the way that we talked about thread, right? It's taking something that you might just have a little bit of, but you're resourceful and you make something beautiful out of it. And I think that is one of the best aspects of all people who have been marginalized and kind of pushed aside. You learn how to make do with what you have, but you learn how to create something that's so much more than anyone ever thought you could. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Shaunna. It's really wonderful to see you talk about this because you're just so, you can see your passion, you can see how much you care about it. So I think that's really wonderful. Well, let's go next to Alyson. Alyson, I'm really curious about how this partnership came about. I don't know how common it is to write historical fiction with a co-author, with co-authors. So if you could tell us about how the partnership came about, and then Shaunna brought up your family histories involved too. So why don't you tell us more about that? Oh, and you got to unmute, Alyson.
Okay. We've now established that I am the least technologically advanced person in this group. I'm really not very savvy, so please forgive me and thank you for being patient with me. So I have been blessed and honored to be friends with Shaunna for I think about 12 years. So we have a really wonderful, longstanding friendship that is really grounded on books. I met Shaunna, and for people who know me, this always sounds so crazy, but I met her in Las Vegas. You know, my husband is a corporate lawyer like Shaunna, and I had just had, potty trained my second child, and he was invited to a special party out in Las Vegas, and I was so desperate to, get a break from my young children that I, gave my, 2 toddlers to my parents and got on a plane to go, have a few days of R&R out there. And I was standing online at this conference for a drink and wearing a very brightly colored papaya colored dress. And I was letting all the men cut in front of me to get a drink because I only usually have one drink a night. I was in no rush. And like any, good author, I was daydreaming, but, happily by myself as I was standing online. And all of a sudden, this beautiful woman comes sort of marching over and says, "Why are you letting every man cut in front of you? You've been waiting online for 15 minutes. I've been watching you. And by the way, I love your dress." And so then she quickly got me a drink, and then we started talking. And her plus one hadn't been able to join her that for the weekend festivities. And we right away, she asked me what I did. It was obvious I wasn't a lawyer, and I told her I was an author, and she, revealed that she had been a literature major at Harvard and had always loved books and dreamt about writing a book one day. And then we were sort of inseparable for the next 2 days, and that was the genesis of our friendship. For the next 10 years, Shaunna was one of those people that every time I was dreaming of a new book, I always wanted to use her as a sounding board. She, as you can tell, she's, fiercely intelligent, passionate, and full of ideas. And I had always dreamt of writing a Civil War book because I had grown up hearing some stories from my grandmother about on our family tree that I had 2 great uncles, both Jewish, who had emigrated from Germany in the mid 1800s, and that part of the, one side of the family moved to Satarsha, Mississippi, where they started a mercantile depot, while another brother remained in New York. And during the time of the Civil War, a brother down south, registered in the Mississippi Regiment, while his, younger brother up north enlisted as a musician in the 31st Regiment of New York. And according to my grandmother, the moral and philosophical divide between the 2 brothers permanently separated the family forever. And so she would always say, we have family down south, but we lost touch with them. And she'd actually said that they had converted to being Baptist at some point, so they weren't even Jewish, by the early 1900s, because of there not supposedly being a lot of Jewish brides down there. But I was always sort of fascinated from this part of my family tree that there were 2 brothers that fought on opposite sides, and how that would have a permanent divide on a family, especially an immigrant family where, you don't have that much family members around you, and how tight those bonds had to be when they initially came. So what happens when something like the Civil War happens and it, threatens their personal economy, and what choices they make during that time period. So it was always sort of fascinating to me. And then I would say about, 5 or 6 years ago, I saw a documentary. It was by Rick Burns, Ken Burns' younger brother, about burying the Civil War dead. And there was a very interesting part of the documentary which highlighted what Shaunna had previously mentioned about how often Black soldiers were forced to bury a lot of the white soldiers, and that how in some cases, they went on to make sort of rough maps where they had buried particular, soldiers, how not only Black soldiers, but also white soldiers, when they buried their friends, maps were created, journal entries were made of where soldiers were hastily buried. And so I sort of started thinking of this idea of what would happen if there was sort of this unexpected friendship between a Black and Jewish soldier, and a map was created that sort of was integral in getting that particular soldier back home. I don't want to give away the plot, whether he's dead or alive, but there was some sort of map that I kind of envisioned in my head that I might be able to add to this whole plot between the 2 brothers that were, separated on this moral and philosophical divide. And as I discussed this with Shaunna right away said it would be so interesting if that Black soldier took that map and gave it to his beloved, and somehow his beloved, knowing that it was very important, not knowing when she'd be able to, would it be able to be given to that white soldier's beloved, that it was sort of permanently preserved in needle and thread. And she started telling me about the history of quilting and how important it was to use, any sort of cloth that could be harvested in order to create something, that was, not only of value, but that could be transported, that was something that you could roll up or pass on to someone. And so she right away sort of was part of this genesis of like the ideas what become permanently in what is now the thread collectors. But, again, that was several years ago. We had this conversation, but it's still in my bones, didn't feel right to start writing the novel. And I always say that because I feel like in my past history of being a novelist, there's always a perfect time when everything comes together to write the novel that will eventually be born. And so I just kept on putting it off, thinking like, this isn't maybe not my story to write. Maybe I can't, I don't know. It didn't feel right. I started writing another novel. And then in the spring of 2020, when the world wrestled with, seeing how, overtly the racial, injustice that was happening, and, sort of, I want to say like a firestorm in our country when we saw George Floyd, brutally murdered in front of our eyes, and this call to sort of reform and social justice, I, called Shaunna and I was like, I kind of feel like now is the time to write this book. And I'd love to write it with you. Would you be interested in doing that with me? And, as Shaunna mentioned, she is, does have a very important day job. And she said, I really think this is something that I do want to do. I've always dreamt of writing a book, and it would be a wonderful place to channel my emotions and also, bring the souls of her ancestors into writing this book. And I think that is sort of the heart of what the Thread Collectors is that we were both writing to sort of give voice to these souls in our past, to give what I always like to describe as putting the heart back into history and sort of drawing from these family stories and, this sense of what makes us human, this sense of like, we really wanted to create a book, not just that was showing history like the Civil War through to marginalized lenses, but also trying to find a way to show what connects us, more than not more, but it connects us in addition to what is dividing us as a country. And so music becomes one of those bonds. It's these two musicians, William and Jacob, who are on the Union Army, and how unexpectedly this friendship is born because they realize that they have this shared love of music, and it becomes this second language for them. And also the female characters like Stella and Lily, even though they're separated by distance, they don't know each other in the beginning of the book, and they're both very smart, ingenious women who are dedicated to trying to contribute to, the war effort and to freedom. And so those things of what unites us, even though two different characters could be, different in class, culture, religion, background, all these things. It's also wonderful in the same way that Shaunna said, we wanted to find the light in the darkness. We wanted to also highlight what connects us, not just what sometimes divides us.
Such a great story all the way around, so many great elements to that. And I think it really shows, what we can accomplish together rather than apart, both in your story and in your real life story. That's just incredible. So thank you for sharing that. Well, let's go to Addison. You have a dual timeline. So what happens? What's going on here in each one of these timelines?
So our first timeline is where the book, the title comes from, the War Librarian. So a war librarian is a person who was sent overseas or who worked in a camp training library in the United States. And like I mentioned before, their job is to prescribe these books for these soldiers. And there was very interesting guidance on how they were supposed to do that. So if a man had a very serious injury that was very painful, but he would recover, he might enjoy a Western because it was adventurous. It would take his mind off it. He would forget where he was. But if a man had a also painful injury that was not he was not going to recover from, a Western would remind him of all the things he couldn't do anymore, horses, adventure. And so he might enjoy a comedy or something lighter. So the librarian, they actually referred to them a lot, as sort of doctors, book doctors, where they would be prescribing these books. And it was born out of a program that was a collaboration between the War Department and the American Library Association. In 1917, when the United States entered World War I, they formed what they called the Library War Service. And their motto, their mission was a book for every soldier. They thought it was so powerful that the soldiers overseas had these books to rely on for moral support, but also for education. There were a lot of nonfiction and technical books, trade books, so that they could learn something that they could then use as a job when they came home. There were books that were English primers for immigrants who were soldiers. There were books in French so that the soldiers in France could learn French. And the War Department, it was just this huge push where they sent millions of dollars, millions of books to over 500 different library locations at base hospitals, at training camps, on Navy transport ships. And I found that magical as someone who has always loved to read and to write. And I think so many of you probably feel the same way about books, that, they are necessary, especially if you're in a situation like these soldiers were in. But what really, that fascinated me, and I liked it, it made me happy. But what really pulled me in was this discovery that the War Department put out these lists of books that were banned, that soldiers were not allowed to access, even if they requested them specifically. And these included books that you might expect, German nationalist books about the German perspective on the war, also pacifist books, and even things like W.B. Du Bois' Open Letter to Woodrow Wilson, which talked about racism and especially lynching in the United States and the lack of government response to such horrors. And that just shocked me, that the War Department could feel so strongly that books were so important to the men and to their emotional well-being when they're overseas, and then at the same time be banning these books in what's ostensibly a war to make the world safe for democracy, a war for, free speech. And so that's sort of where the story came from. Emmeline is a war librarian, as I said, at a base hospital in France. And she not only is having to deal with being in a new environment and seeing these men in various, horrible situations, but also she's grappling with these issues of censorship and what is her job really as a librarian, versus what is she allowed to do as a librarian. And then she also notices a lot of the things that Shaunna was talking about. Of course, she was talking about the Civil War, but in World War I, many of the Black soldiers were relegated to those same positions. They were digging graves. They were making food. They weren't entrusted with the important tasks that white soldiers were. And so Emmeline is also noticing that. She's obviously aware of, the sexism in this sort of environment. And so she's grappling with all of that. And then Kathleen in 1976, even though it's decades later, is unfortunately dealing with a lot of the same issues. She enters the first co-ed class at the Naval Academy, which became co-ed not by the Naval Academy's choice. All of the service academies were required to admit women the same year, in 1976. And so there was pushback from administration, from teachers, and of course from the men that were already at the academy. And so, this book is actually, I'll talk a little bit more, I think, later, but it's dedicated to my sister because she is a pilot, or she's studying to be a pilot. And even today, Emmeline in 1918, Kathleen in 1976, and now my sister in 2022, she's in a world that is sometimes openly hostile and definitely not welcoming to women in a lot of the same ways that, these worlds were. And so I think that's part of what connects Emmeline and Kathleen's threads, as well as the fact that they're both sort of seeking a way to make their voices heard in a space where that's not, freedom of expression is not necessarily encouraged or even allowed.
Thank you, Addison. I think that's really important to kind of tie history together, remind us here in our present day, as advanced as we think we are, we're not beyond all that. We're linked to our past. Well, let's go to Madeline. I combine
No worries.
Addison and Madeline. So we go from the War Librarian. What is a librarian spy? And what I really want to know is, how did you discover this history? It sounds so fascinating.
So I think that as like especially historical authors, we're always probably reading historical articles because they're just incredibly fascinating. And also you never know where your next story idea may come from. So about 2 years ago, I was reading an article that was talking about these librarian spies that were sent over to neutral countries. So you had like, Portugal and you had Sweden, and they would go into these, like basically like safe sort of countries, and they would, like I was saying before, really gather as much intel as they could. And it's interesting because some things that seem like they would be like a really benign sort of detail could be very pertinent to something that's happening with the enemy. So, like for example, in Warsaw with the Jewish ghetto, at one point they were starting to collect all the furs from all the Jews there. And the reason they were actually doing that is because they were getting ready to actually attack Russia. And so it seems like that would be such a benign little feature, but really it had very, very important implications attached to it. And so that's why they were going through and gathering a lot of this sort of intelligence from foreign soil. Another thing too is you had all these different countries that were in these neutral countries. So you could have a table full of Nazis, you could have a table full of SOE agents, you could have a table full of Americans. I mean, everybody just really sort of mixed together because of the fact that it was neutral. And the dictator at the time, Salazar, worked very hard to establish that neutrality. He had this material called tungsten, which was used to make arms. It was used to make, bullet casings. And that is really what helped him be able to maintain that neutrality for as long as he could. And it's also interesting because the fact that it was a neutral country and you didn't have to pay, or rather send your soldiers out and make sure that they were provided for, you also didn't have rationings. So you didn't have, all the issues with no sugar or coffee. You didn't have to worry about blackouts or anything along those lines. So our librarian spies, the thing that really intrigued me a lot was the fact that these librarians were picked out oftentimes because of their ability to speak a different language, and also their ability to be able to really work the microfiche, be able to take pictures, and because you only had so much space that you could send back to America. With it being neutral, with Portugal being neutral, they questioned everything. So you had these American clippers that would go back to America, so nothing was really questioned. So you could put everything on these microfiche. But when they would try to send the actual books and papers on ships, it would get locked in sort of like a quarantine where they would receive all these questions. Why do you have all this Nazi paraphernalia? Because, of course, they're trying to maintain their neutrality. So these librarian spies really were actually kind of sent over with very little training. And if you guys have really watched or have, obviously, I think everybody knows about Ian Fleming's 007. And Casino Royale was actually based off of his time in Lisbon, Portugal. So that will give you an idea of the consummate spies our poor librarian spies were up against. And I thought, that would make such an interesting book, is really sort of like this poor librarian spy who is so used to her comfort zone and knows everything about where she is, and being sent over to this country where she knows nothing about. And the manual that she's been given for everything that's happened that's going on in Portugal, and the rules to follow is completely outdated. And how does she sort of make her way through that? And, in researching Lisbon, something that I hadn't really appreciated as much until I started really digging into my research, and something that I hope that people really come away with, is what the refugees had to endure while they were in Portugal. So because of Portugal being neutral, everybody, like all of the Jewish refugees that were fleeing Nazi occupation, really ended up in Portugal in the hopes of being able to go to, Canada or America, South America, Africa, like wherever they could to escape persecution. And even though it would seem that they were lucky sort of to be able to actually escape the Nazis, it was a very tenuous sort of safety. You at any point in time, the Nazis could have attacked Portugal, and once more they would fall under Nazi occupation. But then you also, unfortunately, there were a lot of countries that didn't want to allow anybody in. A lot of times you would hear like the fifth agent being cited, where they were worried about somebody who was coming over pretending to be a refugee, but really they were, infiltrating the country. And so they kind of struck up the fear, and especially in America, of this fifth agent. But unfortunately, really, a lot of it had to do with anti-Semitism. And of course, nobody wanted to say, oh, well, we're anti-Semitic, so we're not letting any more Jews in. And so they made this red tape very, very thick for people to be able to actually come into America. And so you had to file all this ridiculous paperwork. You had exit visas, you had transit visas. If you had any of those, you had to be able to get a boat pass within time. And if you missed the boat pass, then you had to start it all over again. And at the time, you also had the PVDE, which is the Portuguese Special Police, who the refugees had to check in with once a month. And if all their visas expired, then they could be arrested. And apparently, the Gestapo actually trained the PVDE. They were very, very unkind. And so it was a very dangerous sort of situation, especially for people who oftentimes left with only the clothes on their back. And so, Portugal was a really, really incredible sort of part of the war that I had never really explored before. And getting to learn so much about what everybody went through there was just incredible. And then, on the other side, we had my character, Elaine, who is actually modeled after. I read about this amazing woman who did run these printing presses with the underground. And women running printing presses back then really was not a very common thing. But even though Lyon was the capital of the printing, all the printing in the oh my goodness, in the Renaissance, I almost said resistance, and obviously in the Renaissance, but so you had no shortage of people who were willing to write these articles, but you didn't always have people who knew how to properly operate the machinery. So you had, your engraver, you had your typographer, you had the people who actually ran the press. And so having her learn how to work all of this, it was very uncommon for a woman to do. And when I had the opportunity to go to France while I was in the French Resistance Museum, which is actually inside of the Gestapo headquarters, they had taken an entire room and they modeled it after the underground printing, like a printing setup. And in there was the actual printing press that Lucien Guisniac, who really was my inspiration for Elaine, actually used during World War II, which was really just such a really, really profound moment for me. And I took like 1 million pictures, but you know how when your flash isn't on, how they all come out blurry? So out of 1 million pictures, I have one that is clear. I'm really lucky that I even got that one. But it really was so incredible just getting to see all of that, and even with my trip to Lisbon and to Lyon, getting to almost sort of walk in the footsteps of my characters. And so and when I travel for my books, I try to walk as much as possible so that I really do get the lay of the land. So in my head, I'm thinking, okay, Rue de Sala goes to Rue de Plat, and really I'm actually following it in my head, almost like a video game. And so it really does just bring those characters to life so much.
Thank you, Madeline. Yeah, I never would have even thought of Portugal. Never occurred to me. What was Portugal doing during World War II? Well, our time is just flying by. I do want to get to each of you one more time here before we end, but I'll make a couple quick announcements first. First, I do want to thank everyone who has made a contribution. This event is free, and we're so grateful for everyone that's able to attend, but it does really help as a small independent press. Your contributions go back towards hosting more events like this. And as if you've heard any of this, you can see how valuable this is. I want to remind you to, if you can, pick up these books, to buy these books. If you can't buy them, get them from your local library, borrow them from a friend, whatever you can do, and then leave reviews if you can too. That really helps these authors, and we want to support these authors because, as you can see, they're doing some really great work. And I do just want to reiterate how valuable I think what all of you are doing is, and it's really wonderful to hear you talk about it and to see how passionate all of you are about it. That's one of the reasons I started my press, History Through Fiction. I started out as a historian myself, and then I moved into fiction. And you don't get a lot of fiction writers don't get their just dues, praise for that research that you're doing, for that you're bringing history to life in a way that nonfiction can't do. And I just think that's incredibly valuable, and you're just doing so much work, not just to research the history, but then to develop these characters and these settings, and I think that's really wonderful. So before we end things, let's just go around to each of you, and I just want you, maybe from your own perspective, why do you write historical fiction, and what do you see as is the value in it? So Jennifer, if you could start us off there.
Unmute. I'm often asked because it's, I talk about how I love the research part of the writing process, because to me it's like historical detective work. And I'm often asked, well, if I love that part of it so much, why don't I just write nonfiction instead of fiction? My flippant answer is, oh, because fiction is more fun. But the real answer is that I think that most, not to generalize too much, but history writing, biography, and just straight history tells us what happened, but historical fiction can show us what it felt like for the people who actually lived it. And historical fiction takes the reader into that era, into those challenging circumstances, and lets them see them through the eyes of that character, sometimes more than one perspective in the same book. And I really think that being placed within another person's perspective helps you develop empathy. You really need to understand how that fictional person sees the world and why they do the things they do and why they justify the choices they make. And I really like to believe that by being a reader, we develop our empathy. Our empathy grows like a muscle. And I really like to believe that the skill that we develop while reading fiction, we then can take on and apply to real life. Like if you learned how to understand why this difficult character that perhaps you didn't like did these things that you maybe didn't approve of, or how someone on the other side of it came through incredibly difficult circumstances with grace and courage, then I think maybe in real life, when you're dealing with a difficult person, or if you're dealing with a very challenging situation of your own, you can apply those skills and offer that understanding to real people in your own life. So that's why I prefer to be writing fiction. It's something that's very valuable to me as a reader, and it's something I like to share with other people through my own writing.
Thank you, Jennifer. I love that idea of, you have to exercise your empathy, and then it can grow like a muscle. Shaunna, you're newer to historical fiction. What are your thoughts on that?
So, as Alyson mentioned, I was a literature major in college, but I say that if I had had more courage, I would have been a history major. When I was in undergrad, I thought that history, frankly, it looked like the province of a lot of guys, a lot of white guys. They knew a lot of dates. They knew facts that I just didn't have at my fingertips. So I said, I love words. I know how to read. I'm going to do this. But I think I was missing the point, right? Because as Jennifer basically alluded to, history is individual stories. And I've always loved individual stories. So that's what fascinates me about history. Why historical fiction and why it's important for me, and frankly, why it's important for me as a Black woman, is because I think it allows you to have really difficult conversations in a way that can perhaps not be as threatening. Some of the most honest and raw conversations about my experience as a Black woman, Alyson's experience as a white Jewish woman, that happened during the course of collaborating on the Thread Collectors, happened in the context of history. It makes it a little bit more removed. It allows you to access it in a different way. It doesn't have to be, I'm red, you're blue, or I think this and you think that. You can look at something different and think about how you can perhaps bend a little bit. And I think that the bending, not the breaking, is something that we all need to figure out how to do a little bit more. So I think history, it just illuminates us. It can help us grow, and it can help us talk about things that we don't really want to talk about sometimes. So that's why I'm a historical fiction fan, and it's why I hope to continue to be a historical fiction writer.
Thank you, Shaunna. Yeah, I'm so glad to hear your perspective and to hear you say that you're going to continue writing historical fiction. Alyson, what do you think about the value of historical fiction, and why do you write it?
Feel very similar to Jennifer and Shaunna. I mean, for me, I do think it's very important to say that a lot of my intention of writing historical fiction is to build empathy, to figure out answers for things that I didn't quite understand when I embarked on writing on this particular time period. I always feel like every book starts with a question that I don't know the answer to, or I might not know anything about that historical backdrop, but I personally have a tremendous amount of curiosity to figure out what that answer is, or to learn more about that historical period. And so there's this, sense of my quest to sort of understand better that's fueling the research. But then there's also this need to feel like I want to be able to share that with my readers. And how do you go about doing that? And I think, when you can enable a reader to walk in the footsteps of an individual, like Jennifer had said, and you have a sense of empathy for their experience, and even if there's something that you don't, like about that character, that you start to be able to put their experience in time and place and struggle, and, you start to feel history come alive in a way that you can't feel from a textbook. And I think that's really important. I think when you think about how many of us who didn't intend to be history, majors might have tuned out during class, when we are in school. But when you're actually feeling alive and you're sort of the shadow of a character, as they're delving into all sorts of challenges, I think history becomes alive. And I think that's really exciting to sort of bring it alive for the reader. And how you do that, I mean, every one of us creates a landscape of that historical backdrop in a different way. And I think you bring to that landscape whatever your attributes are, from your background, from your education. I like to say that, before I was a writer, I was this failed painter, and I studied a lot of, art history. And so for me, I love to feel that I'm recreating a landscape in which you can see everything and feel everything. And it's very sensory rich. And that does require going to the countries like Madeline said, and, doing that sort of research where you're not just looking at the physical landscape of the buildings and the fauna and the foliage, but also the people's faces and the way they eat and the way they interact with their family, and researching, how important education might be in that particular culture. All those things go to creating a novel. And I think the intricacy of taking all of those pieces and assembling it so that it's a working whole in a novel, and it doesn't feel didactic, but it feels like you're stepping into this world where along the character, you're not only like smelling the roses, but feeling the whatever, is threatening, the political crises of that time, is really exciting to do. You are making history come alive. So it's something that I don't think you have, the ability to do as fully when you're writing nonfiction. I think there is this implicit freedom to be able to create in your own special, unique signature when you're writing. And I think that's, for me, really exciting.
I think that's a great way to look at it, a great way to put it, putting your own stamp on history while also, sharing it through your own experience. So Addison, what do you think? You're now written 2 historical novels. Why historical fiction?
Can we hear me? Okay. I definitely agree with everything that everyone else said. Jennifer, was talking about empathy, and I did my master's in reading education. I'm an elementary school teacher. And I remember an article that one of my teachers showed us once that fiction readers actually do score higher on measures of empathy than other readers and non-readers. So just to throw that out there. I think, to add a little bit, I specifically, both of my novels are dual timelines. So, we have 1918, 1976, In the Light of Luna Park. We have 1926 and 1950. And I was talking to Steve of the Circulating Ideas podcast recently, and he put it really well. He said that having 2 timelines makes the present sort of a third timeline. So in looking at what things were like for Emmeline in 1918, and what things were like for the women around her and the Black soldiers and the immigrants, and then looking at how much of that has changed and how much of it has not changed in 1976 when Kathleen is in the Naval Academy, that's a direct comparison, and it sort of forces you to think about, what about now? What's the same? what's different, what progress have we made, what progress do we still need to make. And so I think, it sounds counterintuitive, but I think that historical fiction illuminates the present sometimes better than contemporary fiction can, because when the setting is one that we're accustomed to, when it takes place in 2022 in the city where you live or the country where you live, you don't question people's beliefs or their surroundings. But when you're reading here, you think, how could they have thought that? How could they have done that? And it makes you reflect on today's world in the same way, I think. So that's what draws me in historical fiction in general, but especially to writing dual timeline.
That's a really good point. It's sort of a measuring stick for where are we at.
Exactly.
Well, Madeline, you get the last word. No pressure.
Oh man, y'all are making it hard to follow with such eloquent responses, and really you guys have covered just so much of what makes historical fiction just such a wonderful thing to read and write. And I have to say also, I've always been a huge historical fiction reader. So I've been super looking forward to tonight just to hear all of you guys. Jennifer and Addison, I have both of your books, and I have the Thread Collector on pre-order. I'm so excited for all of you guys. The only thing that I can really think to add that hasn't already been so eloquently said is just that, for me, one of the things that I love about historical fiction is that it's like this wonderful brain candy with this nugget of knowledge in the middle. It's like the best kind of Tootsie Pop there is out there. And I think that's what really makes people remember historical fiction so well. I think we've all, unfortunately, had to be subjected to some of those nonfictions that are a little dry. And it's really hard to remember what you read when it's kind of dry. But when you're invested, when your heart is pounding, like you were saying, Jennifer, with the empathy, and you're right there with the character, you remember so well. And all of these stories that we're telling are stories that need to be remembered, not just our generation, but the next generation and the generation after that. And the more that we can bring sort of these entertainment reads, and we can offer the truth with a lot of this entertainment and letting people experience in somebody else's shoes, the longer these stories will be remembered for. And that is so incredibly important.
Thank you, Madeline. I love that visual. I might steal that from you.
Go for it.
Well, once again, thank you to our panelists. Thank you to everyone who showed up here in the audience today and registered. Congratulations on all of your novels, and I can't wait to read them all and to see what's coming next from you. This event has been recorded. It will be available at the original link in perpetuity, and I'll also put it up on YouTube. So if you missed any part of it, you can check back and hear it. So thanks again to everyone, and have a wonderful evening.